Welcome to Gospel Lessons. I'm Kevin Prince. Today we're continuing our series on false traditions, beliefs we often pass down in the church but are not rooted in Scripture or the Gospel. These traditions, while sometimes harmless, can prevent a deeper understanding of doctrine. Today we will be discussing the translation method and how it differs from Revelation. Joining me is Bruce Porter, a renowned scholar with degrees in ancient Near Eastern and Middle East studies, specializing in Semitic languages and religious history. Bruce has authored over 16 books and is well known for his research on the Pearl of Great Price. I first met him on a life-changing tour in 2018, which inspired this Gospel Lessons YouTube channel. Now, if you've never traveled with Bruce, I highly recommend it. He frequently speaks and guides on LDS-based cruises with Go and Do Travel. These cruises offer opportunities to connect with like-minded members and learn from speakers like Bruce. I'll be joining the Momentum 2026 cruise with him, and if you're interested, use promo code PRINCE for $100 off. All proceeds from Gospel Lessons, including sponsorships, go to charity. Bruce, thanks for joining me again. Appreciate having you here.
Well, it's good to be with you, Kevin. I appreciate the opportunity.
This is such a fun series where we're going to talk about traditions and myths and things that we learn and then we end up finding they don't exactly match to the historical record or to reality and things like that. And today we're going to be talking about the translation method used for the Book of Mormon. And this has a couple of different facets to it. First and foremost, a lot of people, I don't know if it's a lot of people, I've heard many people say that they feel that they've been misled by the church. That the idea is that Joseph Smith had the Urim Thummim. They were like little glasses. He put them on. The gold plates were in front of him. He was almost like reading the gold plates and dictating off what he was seeing as he was, looking over the plates, and then whichever scribe at the time was there would then write it down. And this narrative was believed, was taught, I was taught this, and even reinforced through various things such as artwork in the church. To this day, you can find paintings of Joseph Smith with the glasses looking over the gold plates with the scribe there. And then when we now hear, and much of this is due to additional transparency in the church, the Joseph Smith papers coming out, a lot of additional contextual information in history comes out, and we learned this wasn't exactly the process, or maybe a part of the process, or it happened in different ways, and a lot of people feel like they've been misled. For those who wanted to dig deep, and most people don't, the information was always there, but we kind of have these traditions that got passed down. So let's start with the idea of the translation method itself. Take us through how it actually happened and what you think about this this narrative that has kind of perpetuated throughout the church since then.
Well, translation is interesting. It's not just the Book of Mormon that we need to think about, but it's the Book of Abraham. Then you could go to the inspired version of the Bible we call the Joseph Smith translation. It could go to the Book of Moses. It could go to the parchment hid up by John. So translation becomes very important in the process of translation. Joseph was very, very clear. And to begin with, as you say, this information has been out there for 190 years. There's nothing new about how Joseph Smith translated. It's new to people, just like the gospel is new to every generation. Everything else is new to every generation too, and some people get all freaked out because they didn't know about it when the information has been there for generations. So Joseph Smith was very clear about his ability to translate. He called it a gift and power of God. If you remember when he lost the 116 pages, or when he had given the 116 pages to Martin Harris, he comes home to Harmony there, and his wife Emma says, well, just translate it again. He says, I can't. I've lost the power. I've lost the ability to translate. So he's telling us that it's not him. We have records that or accounts of Joseph that when he was translating and he stopped for a while, he stopped for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, he stopped translating. He didn't ask the scribe to read back what the last thing that he translated. He would just start with the next word and go on. That tells you he's not doing it. He's not giving us an intellectual translation. That it's a revelatory translation. So if he were going along and he just stopped and 2 weeks later he comes back, anybody else doing an intellectual translation would say, well, read me the last paragraph so I know where to start, but Joseph didn't do that. He just immediately picked up with the next word and continued on, which tells us it was a revelatory translation, not an intellectual translation. And the Book of Mormon especially is a first translation. I mean, the Bible has gone through many, many different translations, many, many different manuscripts, many different scholars. But the Book of Mormon is a single translation from one language to English, and it's a revelatory translation rather than a transliteration or an intellectual translation.
So let's talk about the tools Joseph used in order to perform this revelatory process, this translation. We know that with the gold plates, there was also the sword of Laban, there was the breastplate, and then there was the Urim and Thummim. And the common belief was that the breastplate had the bows, the silver bows, the Urim and Thummim were placed in those, and he could look through them, or that was kind of what everybody assumed or thought. And maybe he did that, looked through them, but then the idea was that he was looking at the gold plates. Tell us when and where and how he used the Urim and Thummim specifically first, and then we can get into the other seer stones in a moment.
But we know that the Urim and Thummim was used for a lot of the translation, at least for sure the first 116 pages. Urim and Thummim is taken for a while and then given back to Joseph Smith. We get section 10 from that. But I think the Urim and Thummim to a revelatory prophet is used to train for revelation. I think it was used to train the mind and the spirit for the revelation. And I think that carries on with what we call the seer stone after the fact. But I think that was used more for Joseph Smith. Part of revelation, part of a revelatory revelation is you have a catalyst, and then you have to then there's a focus that has to take place on the catalyst. We see this when Oliver Cowdery is promised in the Doctrine and Covenants that he could translate other records. He tries but doesn't do it. And the Lord says, you took no thought save it was to ask. You didn't study it out in your mind. You didn't ponder. You didn't focus on what you were doing. There was no focus there. And I think that the Urim and Thummim that Joseph used was to help train him to focus his mind in that revelatory process. We don't even really see a whole lot of Doctrine and Covenants revelatory issues or revelatory statements in the Doctrine and Covenants until after the Book of Mormon is published, until after he's done the translation with the Urim and Thummim, and some will say with the seer stone. And it doesn't matter to me whether it's Urim and Thummim or seer stone. Either way, what does matter, it was revelatory, and it's real, and it's true, and it's a correct translation as best that's for us. And so there has to be a catalyst, and then you have to be able to focus. And I think the Urim and Thummim or the seer stone was used to help focus. I think the catalyst was the plates, and he had to study it out in his mind. He had to think about it. But that revelatory ability, he tells Emma when he gets back to Harmony after Martin Harris told him that he's lost the manuscript. He says, "I've lost the power to translate."
That's fascinating, because you've talked about this before, the catalyst and then the focus. And because some people will say, well, if he just did this through a revelatory process, why did he need the plates at all? Why did Moroni have to show him? He could have just received that revelation without it. But there does seem to be something about having a catalyst there, having the plates there that helped him perform that. Just like it seemed like the mummies or the scrolls under the arms of the mummies helped him focus as the catalyst to bring forth the Book of Abraham. Him having the Bible perhaps, that helped him focus to do the translation of the Bible and give us the inspired book of Moses and others. So there does seem to always have to be a catalyst there. And so I don't necessarily understand why, but it does seem to be the case. Then when it comes to the focus with the Urim and Thummim, it does seem interesting that he did need those at the beginning to train his mind, but perhaps not later that he needed that. His mind had been focused and trained in a way that didn't require that anymore. Is that correct?
That's that's the way I see it, because we see so many revelations coming through the Doctrine and Covenants or in the Doctrine and Covenants after the fact, without a Urim and Thummim or without a seer stone. Many of those revelations, but most of those revelations that we get in the Doctrine and Covenants are after the Book of Mormon, after he's trained his mind. The catalyst can be a question too. For instance, the parchment hid up by John that we have there in those opening sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, the parchment hid up by John. It's a translation of a parchment that was hid up by John. Well, the question was, the catalyst at that time was, did John, from what they're doing in the translation of the Bible, did John was he given the opportunity to live until Christ comes? That question becomes the catalyst that leads to the revelation of an ancient text or a parchment hid up by John. And like you say, the papyrus that Joseph Smith had became the catalyst for the revelatory translation of the Book of Abraham. And that's why people get all upset. Well, this doesn't say what the papyrus says, blah, blah, blah. They're not understanding the process of revelatory translation. And the Book of Mormon, even Joseph didn't look at the plates. It was there as a catalyst, as the papyrus was there as a catalyst. And the Urim and Thummim and the seer stone could have been used both for the translation of the Book of Mormon, a way to focus. I mean, it's talked about how Joseph would put the seer stone in a hat and place his head in the hat. Emma tells us that's often how he did it, and that the plates would be on the table wrapped in a napkin or handkerchief. And but it's what he's doing is blocking out the world by placing his head in the hat. There's nothing magical about placing your head in the hat. But you're blocking out the world. Now we take, even us today in our prayers in the evening time, we take the catalyst of the day or the catalyst of our family, and we go into a room, or a darkened room, or as scriptures say, a closet, whatever you want to do. We sometimes try and block out the world so that we can focus on the catalyst of the day. This is the whole purpose of a temple building itself. It's so that the temple is there to maintain the sacred space around the altar, but it separates us from the profane world. It's a place where we can put our head in the hat, so to speak, where we can go into the temple, and we don't have to be sidetracked by what's going on in the world, because we're in the temple where we can focus on the issues at hand or the events of the day if we are looking for revelation. But we can do that at home as well as in the temple by prayer. And so we block the catalyst. We take the catalyst of the day, block out the world, and then we seek for the revelation that's going to be that we need or that we're looking for. And the translation can be the same way.
I think it's important that people realize, I think we get in our modern idea of what translation is. I was over in Europe not too long ago, and I had my phone there, and I downloaded a translation app. And the app, anything I put it up on, and I can scan any plaque, any sign, anything, and it will translate it immediately from whatever language that is into English, so I can read it. And people imagine that's what the Urim and Thummim was doing is as he looked through it, it was just translating, but that's not how it worked. And as you read the record and understand it, that's not how he went through it. And these objects were used for a different purpose, to train the mind. And the more we study that, not only do we not have to get upset about how this process happened, but we can also learn it as how we can in our life better learn to focus, separate ourselves, and connect with God to receive our own revelation in our life for our families and the things that we need. I think. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would. The focus is very important. I've mentioned before that I have a default. If I'm looking for revelation, or seeking for understanding on one thing or another, that becomes a kind of a default focus. When I'm at home or wake up in the middle of the night, or when I go to bed before I go to sleep, or when I'm driving somewhere, if I really want an answer to that question, I keep focusing my mind on it, and the answer will come. The answer comes, sometimes in a surprising way. The answer comes, but it's because of the focus that's there and what's going on. And so I take the catalyst, which can be the question, and I begin focusing on that as much and as often as I can, until I get I would consider it a revelatory answer somehow. I'm not looking for messengers or anything like that. I'm just looking for knowledge and understanding in certain things and certain doctrines and topics. So, and Joseph Smith was doing the same thing. Anything that was an ancient record, Joseph called a translation. Things that weren't an ancient record, he called a revelation. The Doctrine and Covenants is filled with revelations that Joseph Smith had. And some of those he received the earliest ones he received sometimes using the Urim and Thummim, as we see in section 10 and others. He received using the Urim and Thummim. But by the time most of those revelations come, when he learned to recognize the revelation, when the catalyst was there, he asked the question, he learned to recognize the inspiration and the direction of the Spirit to give us a revelation. Now, when he gives us a translation, anytime Joseph called something a translation, it was because it was an ancient record at one time. The Book of Mormon was an ancient record, therefore he calls it a translation. The Book of Abraham was an ancient record, so he calls it a translation. The parchment hid up by John was an ancient record, and so he called it a translation. The Book of Moses is called a translation, even though it comes from the inspired version. And the Bible that we have, the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, he calls it a translation because it is an ancient record. It was an ancient record. And so he's giving us the inspired version of that translation. Now we can say, well, how can he do that? Why would he expect him to do that? Well, how do you think Moses gives us the book of Genesis? Moses wasn't around for Genesis. So Moses is giving us the book of Genesis to the children of Israel. He gives the book of Genesis because it's a revelatory translation of the book of Genesis. And so he can do the same thing that Joseph did, because both are prophets and prophets in their own right, and revelatory, receive revelation and translation, powers of translation too. And so anything that was a translation. Now this gets into the book of Abraham, this whole concept of translation. People will say, well, facsimile number 2, the second one, the round one, they will often argue that and say, well, this doesn't say what Joseph Smith said it said. Egyptologists can take this facsimile, this hypocephalus, and they can translate it, and it doesn't say what Joseph Smith said it said. Well, Joseph Smith doesn't call those translations. He doesn't say this is a translation of the hypocephalus. This isn't a translation of the facsimile 1 or facsimile 2 or facsimile 3. He doesn't call them translations. He calls them explanations. Even Abraham, in that first chapter, he says, I will refer you to the representation at the beginning of this record. Even Abraham says that these facsimiles are representations. They represent something. They're not translations. And Joseph didn't call them translations. The text he called a translation because it was the book of Abraham. But the facsimiles he called explanations. Klaus Baer, who was an Egyptologist at the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, when questioned by Nibley and others about facsimile number 2, he says, I can tell you what it says, but I can't tell you what it means. Joseph, on the other hand, is saying, I'm telling you what it means, not what it says. That's why it says explanation at the top of it. And what he's saying is, I'm telling you what it meant to Abraham as a representation. I'm not telling you what it says. And people are using this as an excuse to leave the church or declare that Joseph wasn't a prophet because the hieroglyphics don't translate the same way that the explanation is going on. But Joseph is saying it's not a translation. This is an explanation and what it meant to Abraham. And he says this represented this to Abraham, and this represented this to Abraham, is what he's saying. And Abraham calls them representations himself. So they're not meant to be translation. Yet the Egyptian, the hieroglyphics translate into concepts that Latter-day Saints or members of the church are familiar with, concepts of going to the next world, concepts of resurrection, concepts of exaltation, becoming like God. That's what it's talking about, which is an aspect of Abraham's endowment and things that he's learning within the text itself.
Well, Bruce, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us today and learning about false traditions. Remember to subscribe so future episodes are easier to find. Thanks for watching.